Hello, friends, and welcome to the PrepWell podcast. I'm your host, Phil Black. And if you have an 8th, 9th, or 10th grader with big aspirations, like the Ivy League, or military service academies like West Point, ROTC, or athletic scholarships, boom, you've come to the right place. My specialty, my superpower, if you will, is preparing families for these competitive programs. I'll teach you what your child should do, when they should do it, and how you can help. So stick around and prepare to out-prepare. Hello, friends, and welcome to the PrepWell podcast. Believe it or not, it's getting close to the time of year when your child should start thinking about next year's classes. So I wanted to give you a quick primer on how that conversation might go. And I wanted to get this out before the holiday in the hopes that you may have some downtime to discuss this with your child at a very high level. It's not necessary to get into the nitty-gritty details about specific classes right now, but it would be a good idea to take their temperature on how their workload is now and what they hope for next year. Why is class selection so important? Well, primarily because it's one of the top 3 criteria that colleges use when making admissions decisions. Class selection, along with GPA, and an SAT and ACT score are the big 3 factors that weigh heavily in admissions, right out of the gate. There are other factors, of course, but these are the factors that make up the initial screen. You do not want to hit the initial screen. In some ways, class selection acts as a referendum on how much your child has challenged themselves during high school. We also call this the rigor of their academic curriculum. Did they take the standard classes that every student takes? Did they take a few honors or AP classes? Or did they take the maximum allowable of every advanced or weighted course available at their high school? Colleges look at this very closely. They go over transcripts, line item by line item. It's not the case, especially these days, that an admissions officer simply looks at a 4.0 GPA and assumes that they know the true academic ability of the student. With the wide disparity in high schools and how they grade, and whether there's perceived grade inflation at certain schools, the traditional 4.0 GPA, quote unquote, gives the admissions officer very limited information without a deeper dive. And now with COVID redefining admissions criteria, some wonder how much grades will ever matter anymore. And given what's going on in the world, it's important to note that, in my opinion, class selection has probably become the number 1 factor in how colleges assess the college readiness of students, overtaking both GPA and SAT and ACT scores. Why? Because the disparity among high schools and their grading systems, and whether a high school uses a 4.0 scale or a 0 to 100% scale or a mixed scale, are they allowing pass-fail grades? Are they, like California, allowing students to revise and resubmit writing samples as many times as they want to increase their grades? It makes it more difficult for colleges to use one number, like a GPA, as a proxy for student academic performance. They just can't trust it. The admissions officers must now do more work. And of course, we've all heard about the trend away from requiring SAT or ACT scores, and how many schools are going test optional or even test blind. Well, this just eliminates yet another data point for admissions officers to use to assess applicants. So what do they have left? The rigor of a student's classes. And that's why class selection is becoming such an important signal for how academically serious and competent your child is. Okay, so if I've convinced you that class rigor has become maybe the most important factor in admissions, what can you do to optimize this process? Well, let's first start out with your child's level of aspiration. If they have their heart set on MIT or the Harvards or the Stanfords of the world, then there's one way to go. If they're shooting for slightly less competitive schools, then there's another way to go. If they're just trying to get through high school on their way to a community college, then there's yet another way to go. Why don't we start out with the high aspiration student? High schoolers who are focused on highly selective schools need to prove their academic chops. And if the SAT or ACT is becoming less of a thing to demonstrate their prowess, then obviously they need to focus more intently on the classes they take and the grades they get in those classes. And of course, later on, how they relate to their teachers of those classes. In an ideal world, a motivated student would take the maximum number of high ability classes that are offered at their school and do well in them, meaning getting A's. I'm talking about AP classes, honors classes, and often community college classes. And keep in mind, as you're thinking this through, that colleges will look at how a particular student does relative to the rest of the student body in their high school. They're not going to compare your child with a student from a high school across the country. That would be comparing apples to oranges, and they try to avoid that. They want to see how well your child stacks up against other students in a similar academic environment. It's also important to know that theoretically, students should not be penalized for not taking the quote-unquote hard classes, the AP and the honors classes, if those classes were not offered at their high school. Presumably, it's not the student's fault if AP Physics wasn't offered at their school, so they shouldn't be compared or downgraded to a student who took AP Physics at a different high school. Now, some super motivated students faced with this dilemma, they won't want to take any chances, so they will make heroic efforts to take these types of classes from other high schools, or online, or from community colleges, to prove their academic abilities. But that's pretty rare. So you have to think to yourself and do a little research here. Which classes in my child's high school are the top performing students taking? Or which classes have the top performing students taken in years past? Once you figure that out, then you have to decide if your child is ready for that level of academic rigor. Because remember, some students are 100% academic. That's all they do. They're not involved in sports or drama or band or Girl Scouts. They are strictly academics. Your child should be careful comparing their class choices with the class choices of the 100% academics, especially if your child has other things going on, whether it's sports or work or internships or marching band, whatever it might be. It can be dangerous to sign up for all AP and honors classes just because Bill or Sandy did if your child will not perform well in them. The phrase that I want you to remember is as follows. You want your child to be challenged but still successful. You don't want them to be challenged by taking the most rigorous classes, but then get a bunch of B's and maybe even be on the bubble to get a C. That would not be great. That would show poor judgment on the student's part, that they couldn't anticipate that they would have a hard time. They'll get a little bit of credit for being bold and confident, but not a lot of credit for their performance. This is where the balance must be struck. Sit down with your child and write down all of the things they plan to do next year. Varsity soccer, yearbook, photography club, volunteer work, student government, whatever it might be. And then ask them how many AP or honors classes they think they could handle given these obligations. Obviously, this is highly specific, so I hesitate to provide any blanket recommendations about you should take 4 or 5 or 3 or a maximum of 2. It also has to do with how motivated your student is, your child is. What has their track record been in high school so far? And whether their life will significantly be busier next year. And of course, what type of college or colleges they aspire to. Let's try an example. Let's say your child wants to be competitive at the most highly selective colleges. And for that reason, they feel pressured to max out as many AP and honors classes as possible. They also, however, happen to play sports and volunteer, and they're active in student government. Okay, so you'll have to make a joint decision here as to whether they have the horsepower to perform well in all of those advanced classes, even with this pretty active extracurricular calendar. That's not to say that they can't handle it, but it's important to be honest here. Now, if you decided that maxing out AP classes would be too much, too stressful, too much anxiety, and your child wanted to eliminate one or two AP classes from their proposed schedule, which one or which ones should you or would you eliminate? Now, I would run this question through 3 different filters. Number 1, drop the class that they're least interested in. For example, if your child doesn't like to read, maybe they should skip AP World History, which requires 100 pages of reading a night. Filter number 2, drop the class that is least aligned with their anticipated college major. For example, if they intend to go pre-med, they probably shouldn't drop AP Bio. And filter number 3, drop the class with the killer teacher who makes it their job to work their students to the bone. It might not be worth it. How do you find out about these classes? Which are difficult? Which teachers are strict? Which teachers are more easygoing? Which classes have a ton of reading or gnarly problem sets? You should be able to get most of this information from guidance counselors, from other parents, and from other students who've taken these classes. Of course, if your son or daughter has older siblings, talk to them as well. It might take some effort. In fact, it will take some effort to gather this intel, but it's going to be worth it. Get as much data as you can, anecdotal or otherwise, to help you make an informed decision. The sweet spot is to have just enough advanced classes in your schedule to signal to colleges that you've chosen just the right level of rigor to challenge yourself, but to also be successful. This is not a particularly easy needle to thread. You don't want to sell yourself short by shying away from the hard classes, but you also don't want to expose weaknesses by underperforming in those classes. This is the balance that you should strive for in the next few weeks. Make sure you discuss this with your child. Articulate why class selection has become so important. Have them listen to this podcast and have a mature and open discussion on how to manage these competing interests. And you'll find out there will be a lot of life lessons baked into this conversation, and I wish you the best of luck with it. That's all I've got for you today, folks. Thank you for tuning in. If you know a parent with an 8th grader, 9th grader, 10th grader, even an 11th grader in high school that might find this episode helpful, please share it with them. You can do that by finding that small box with the tiny arrow pointing up. That's the share button. Click on that button, text your friends the link to this episode with a little personal note from you recommending that they give it a listen. If you have questions, comments, or an idea for an upcoming episode, please reach out to me by email. I'd love to hear from you. DM me on Instagram. Check out our blog, Facebook, connect with me on LinkedIn. And I wish you the best. Until next week, goodbye, good luck, and never stop preparing. This podcast is brought to you by PrepWell Academy. PrepWell Academy is my one-of-a-kind online mentoring program that delivers to your 9th or 10th grader a short, highly relevant video from me every week, every Sunday in fact, where I give them a heads up about what they should be thinking about to stay ahead of the game. To get these valuable lessons into your child's hands, please head over to PrepWellAcademy.com and enroll your child today.